For 2,000 years you have been fed a blood-soaked lie. The psychotic madman who fiddled while Rome burned wasn't a monster, he was the victim of history's most ruthless smear campaign. Discover the chilling conspiracy that buried a traumatized boy and forged an immortal demon out of venom. Close your eyes for a moment and conjure the image of the most depraved, unhinged monster human history has ever birthed. Almost instantly, your mind is invaded by a portrait woven from fire and blood. You envision a madman draped in a magnificent golden robe standing high upon a palace balcony, his fingers casually dancing across a lyre. He sings with euphoric passion, while directly beneath him the glorious city of Rome is swallowed by an ocean of screaming flames. You think of a son who stared into the eyes of his own mother and ordered her slaughter, a husband who brutally murdered his wife, a sadist who orchestrated the most horrific blood-soaked persecutions against the early Christians, turning human beings into living torches to illuminate his evening garden parties. For 2 millennia, popular culture, literature, and even our trusted history textbooks have collaborated to carve this immortal statue of absolute evil. In the collective consciousness of the world, Nero is no longer a man made of flesh and bone. He is the very definition of an irredeemable demon, a symbol of rotten power and incurable psychosis. But what if I told you that the greatest crime associated with Nero wasn't committed by him, but against him? What if the history we have been force-fed for 2,000 years is nothing but the most successful, ruthless smear campaign the ancient world has ever witnessed? Myth Erendor warmly welcomes you to a journey into the darkest shadows of antiquity. If you are ready to question everything you thought you knew and uncover the fragile truth hidden beneath the ashes of Rome, please hit that subscribe button to support the channel and join us on this deep dive into history's greatest secrets. Now let us look at the glaring cracks in this monumental lie. History is never a simple, quiet stream, and buried deep beneath the soot of ancient prejudices lie baffling paradoxes that modern scholars simply can no longer ignore. Let me ask you a logical question. If Nero was truly this bloodthirsty leviathan, universally despised and cursed by his society, how do we explain the eerie, haunting phenomena that unfolded the moment his heart stopped beating? Even the aristocratic historians who loathed him the most had to grit their teeth and record an undeniable, uncomfortable truth. The common plebs of Rome wept for him. They mourned him with a profound, shattering grief. For years after his brutal suicide, impoverished citizens would quietly slip through the shadows to lay the freshest spring flowers upon his tomb. The adoration of the masses was so fiercely intoxicating that within a few decades of his passing, no less than 3 Nero impostors emerged from the woodwork. And the chilling part, the public and even factions of the mighty Roman military embraced these phantoms with tears of joy, hailing them as messiahs resurrected from the dead. Does a psychotic arsonist who burns the homes of his own people receive such undying fanatical love from his alleged victims? This is the fracture in the timeline. This is the jagged crack in the 2,000-year-old wall of myth that has imprisoned the truth. This paradox doesn't just pique our curiosity, it forces us to confront a terrifying reality about the nature of power and how memory is weaponized. Are we looking at a monster, or are we looking through the severely distorted, blood-stained lens of his political executioners? Our purpose today is not to absolve a ruler of his genuine, undeniable sins, but to reopen one of the most complex, deliberately buried cold cases of the ancient world. Together, we are going to strip away the suffocating layers of folklore, discard the prejudices that have taken root in our minds, and confront a deeply uncomfortable question. Was Nero truly a demon born of madness, an antichrist beyond salvation? Or was he, in a twisted, tragic sense, merely a fragile pawn, a victim chewed up and spat out by a terrifyingly cruel political machine? To understand how a beloved emperor was transfigured into a monster, we must first unmask the bitter architects of his memory, the aristocratic men who held the pen after his downfall. History, as the old adage warns, is a tapestry woven by the victors, but in the case of Rome, it was woven by the surviving elite. The men who documented Nero's life, historians like Suetonius Tacitus and Cassius Dio, were not impartial journalists seeking an objective truth. They were proud, deeply conservative members of the senatorial class. And this class possessed a profound, simmering hatred for the last Julio-Claudian emperor. Why? Because Nero committed the ultimate political sin. He bypassed the wealthy elites and courted the love of the commoners. He envisioned a Rome where the staggering wealth of the aristocracy could be redirected to fund public games, grain distributions, and extravagant festivals for the impoverished plebeians. He stripped senators of their unchecked authority, taxed their estates, and openly mocked their rigid militaristic traditions by taking to the stage as an artist. In the eyes of the Roman elite, a man of power was meant to be a stoic conqueror, a general soaked in the blood of foreign enemies, not a theatrical performer singing Greek tragedies. They viewed his populism as a dangerous infection, and his artistic soul as a humiliating stain on the dignity of the empire. So when Nero's reign finally collapsed, these men did not just want to erase him, they needed to utterly assassinate his character. They dipped their quills in venom and went to work retroactively transforming every political misstep into an act of apocalyptic madness. A sudden death in the royal family became a calculated poisoning. A grand public performance became a forced hostage situation where women supposedly gave birth in the theater stands because Nero locked the doors. We must ask ourselves when reading these ancient texts, whose truth are we consuming? We are looking at a smear campaign orchestrated by a deeply humiliated political establishment. They knew that if they could paint him as a deranged lunatic, no one would ever question the legitimacy of the violent coup that overthrew him. They built a magnificent, terrifying monster out of ink and parchment, ensuring that the weeping plebs who laid flowers at his grave would be silenced by the deafening roar of a fabricated history. Yet no weapon forged by these disgruntled aristocrats was as devastatingly effective as their twisted recounting of the Great Fire of Rome. We all know the legend by heart, the psychotic emperor standing on the Palatine Hill, plucking the strings of his lyre and singing of the fall of Troy, while the eternal city burned to the ground by his own command. It is a chilling, perfectly cinematic image, and it is a complete and absolute fabrication. When the first sparks ignited in the crowded shops around the Circus Maximus in July of 64 AD, Nero was not even in Rome. He was 35 miles away in the coastal town of Antium. Upon hearing the devastating news, he did not rejoice. He raced back to a burning capital and mounted one of the most organized, desperate relief efforts in ancient history. He threw open the gates of his private gardens and public buildings to shelter the homeless, massive swarms of terrified refugees fleeing the inferno. He paid for food and supplies out of his own private treasury to prevent a mass famine. He even personally participated in the rescue operations, wandering the chaotic, smoke-choked streets without his usual bodyguard. Following the disaster, Nero implemented brilliant, strictly enforced urban planning laws, requiring wider streets and fire-resistant stone for new buildings to ensure such a catastrophe could never happen again. But logic and charity offer no defense against the whispers of a traumatized populace. Because Nero later seized a large tract of the cleared land to build his breathtakingly opulent palace, the Domus Aurea, an insidious rumor began to spread among the desperate masses. The emperor had cleared the land with fire to build his golden dream. Facing a catastrophic loss of public faith, Nero made a calculated, profoundly dark political pivot. He needed a scapegoat, and he found one in a small, deeply misunderstood and widely despised fringe cult known as the Christians. What followed was an undeniable horror: innocent men and women crucified, torn apart by dogs, and burned as human torches. It is a gruesome stain on his legacy that cannot be washed away. However, to understand this tragedy, we must view it not as the isolated madness of an antichrist, but through the terrifyingly cruel lens of Roman justice. Rome was a society that viewed public execution as entertainment, a culture where brutalizing marginalized groups was standard political strategy. Nero did not invent the cruelty. He merely wielded the bloody machinery of his era to deflect blame and survive the political fallout of a natural disaster. Even before the ashes of his ruined capital had fully cooled, the narrative was shifting, preying upon the vulnerabilities of a ruler who was fundamentally unfit for the ruthless machinations of the Roman court. To truly comprehend the tragedy of Nero, we must look at the boy beneath the golden laurel wreath. He was never meant to be emperor. He was thrust onto the blood-stained throne at the tender age of 16, a pawn in the terrifying obsessive ambition of his mother Agrippina the Younger. Agrippina was a political mastermind, a woman who had survived exiles and executions, who married and allegedly poisoned Emperor Claudius just to secure the world for her son. But she did not want Nero to rule. She wanted to rule through him. She envisioned him as a beautiful, compliant puppet while she pulled the strings from the shadows. But Nero was not a conqueror nor a calculating statesman. He was a deeply sensitive, profoundly flawed young man obsessed with poetry, music, and the artistic enlightenment of Greek culture. He wanted to win Olympic wreaths, not military triumphs. Imagine the suffocating claustrophobia of existing in an environment where your passions are viewed as weakness, where every ally is a potential assassin, and where your own mother operates as a shadow dictator threatening to replace you the moment you show independence. The infamous murder of Agrippina is often cited as the ultimate proof of Nero's psychopathy. But strip away the sensationalism, and what remains is a desperate, paranoid struggle for survival. Agrippina was actively plotting against him, courting rival factions, and preparing to tear down the very emperor she had built. In the viper's nest of imperial Rome, there was no room for familial therapy or peaceful retirement. It was a binary world: kill or be killed. The decision to order his mother's death fundamentally broke something within his psyche. It was a horrific, inescapable choice that haunted him for the rest of his life, accelerating his descent into a deep, agonizing paranoia. He began to isolate himself, surrounding himself with sycophants and retreating further into his theatrical delusions. He was a boy given absolute power but denied absolute freedom, crumbling under the weight of an empire he never truly asked to carry. But a fragile heart armed only with a lyre cannot survive forever in an empire built on the edge of a gladius. By 68 AD, the senatorial elite and the provincial governors had finally had enough. The legions in Gaul and Spain raised the banners of rebellion, and the cowardly Senate, emboldened by the military uprising, declared their sitting emperor a public enemy. Nero, terrified and abandoned by his guards, fled into the night to a modest suburban villa. The man who had ruled the known world was suddenly reduced to a trembling fugitive, hiding in a dirt cellar, listening to the approaching hoofbeats of the cavalry sent to execute him. As he pressed a dagger to his own throat, unable to summon the courage to plunge it in, until the very last second he reportedly wept and uttered his famous last words, "Qualis artifex pereo." What an artist dies in me. He did not mourn the loss of his empire, his wealth, or his political power, even in his dying breath. His tragedy was that the world was losing a poet. When we look back at the life of Nero Claudius Caesar, we are forced to confront an uncomfortable truth about ourselves and the stories we choose to believe. We crave monsters. We need irredeemable villains in our history books because they make the complex, morally gray reality of human nature easier to digest. It is far easier to believe that a demon burned Rome than to accept that an empire was governed by a frightened, traumatized artist who was slowly driven mad by the toxic, backstabbing political system that raised him. Nero was not an innocent man. He was vain, deeply flawed, and capable of tremendous cruelty. But he was undeniably human. He was a victim of his mother's ruthless ambition, a hostage to his own absolute power, and ultimately the greatest casualty of an ancient propaganda machine that successfully stole his humanity. So the next time you hear the name Nero, do not just see the flames and the fiddle, see the tears of the commoners who loved him. See the boy trapped in a golden cage. And remember that in the court of history, the truth is often the very first thing to be buried. In the end, the tragic saga of Emperor Nero serves as a powerful testament to the enduring danger of a single narrative. For nearly 2 millennia, the world has blindly accepted the caricature of a madman fiddling while Rome burned, allowing the orchestrated vengeance of a bitter aristocracy to eclipse the reality of a deeply troubled artistic soul. Nero was undeniably the architect of his own dark misdeeds, yet he was equally a victim, crushed by the suffocating weight of his mother's ruthless ambition, trapped within a viper's nest of political betrayal, and ultimately sacrificed upon the altar of senatorial propaganda. His story reveals how easily a human being, with all their profound flaws, vulnerabilities, and desperate desires for love and validation, can be flattened into a two-dimensional monster by those who hold the pen of history. When we strip away the sensationalized myths, we do not find a demon, but a terrified boy forced into a brutal arena he never wished to enter. The ashes of his legacy remind us that history is rarely a mirror of absolute truth. Rather, it is a curated exhibition designed by the victors to validate their own power. By recognizing the humanity buried beneath the venomous ink of ancient historians, we reclaim a more nuanced, authentic understanding of the past, acknowledging that the line between a beloved artist and an apocalyptic tyrant is often drawn entirely by the biases of the storyteller. The profound lesson and modern application. The ultimate lesson of Nero's life is that we must always question the narratives we are handed, especially those that paint individuals in absolute extremes. In our modern era, driven by sensationalized headlines, social media echo chambers, and viral outrage, it is incredibly easy to reduce complex human beings to mere caricatures of good and evil. We still possess that ancient craving for simple monsters and spotless heroes. To apply this to your life today, practice radical critical thinking before passing judgment. When consuming news or witnessing a public downfall, pause and ask yourself, who is telling this story? What do they stand to gain? What context or humanity is being purposefully left out? By refusing to blindly accept the easiest, most sensationalized version of events, you cultivate a mindset of empathy and objective reasoning, protecting yourself from being manipulated by today's modern propaganda machines. Question for discussion. If you could travel back in time to witness one event in Nero's life and discover the actual truth for yourself, which moment would you choose? Please politely share your thoughts in the comments section below so we can all explore different perspectives together. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, please subscribe to the channel to support our work and give us the motivation to keep creating more captivating content for you.